On a crisp October morning in 1066, the fate of an entire civilization hung in the balance on a muddy hillside near Hastings. For over 600 years, Anglo-Saxon England had thrived, creating a sophisticated society with rich traditions, advanced laws, and a distinctive culture that stretched from the windswept shores of Northumbria to the rolling hills of Wessex. But in the space of a single day, all of that would be swept away forever. This wasn't just another medieval battle between rival claimants to a throne. This was the complete annihilation of a way of life, the systematic destruction of an entire ruling class, and the birth of a new England that would be unrecognizable to those who had lived there just hours before. The story of how Anglo-Saxon England met its end begins not with the clash of swords and the thunder of hooves, but with the death of a childless king and the bitter rivalries that tore a kingdom apart. When Edward the Confessor died on January 5th, 1066, he left behind more than just an empty throne. He left behind a succession crisis that would draw warriors from across Europe to English soil, each believing they had the rightful claim to rule the most prosperous kingdom in northern Europe. The speed with which events unfolded in 1066 was breathtaking. Within months, 3 separate armies would march across England, 2 massive battles would reshape the political landscape, and 1,000 years of history would pivot on the decisions made by a handful of desperate men. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by monks who witnessed these events, captures the sense of doom that settled over the land. They wrote of omens and portents, of strange lights in the sky and unnatural storms, as if the very heavens were warning of the catastrophe to come. Harold Godwinson stood at the center of this maelstrom. Crowned king just hours after Edward's death, he was a man forged by decades of warfare and political intrigue. As Earl of Wessex, Harold had proven himself to be perhaps the most capable military commander of his generation. He had crushed rebellions, negotiated with foreign powers, and earned the respect of the English nobility through his combination of strategic brilliance and personal courage. But Harold faced a problem that no amount of skill could solve. His claim to the throne rested on the approval of the Witenagemot, the Council of English Nobles, rather than on the ironclad legitimacy of royal blood. This weakness would be exploited by 2 of the most formidable warriors of the age. From the north came Harald Hardrada, the giant Norwegian king whose very name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. Hardrada had spent decades fighting across the known world, from the frozen rivers of Russia to the sun-baked walls of Constantinople. He had served in the elite Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Emperor, accumulating wealth and battle experience that made him legendary even among the Viking warrior class. Standing nearly 7 feet tall and wielding his massive 2-handed sword with devastating effect, Hardrada represented the last great surge of Viking expansion westward. But it was the third claimant who posed the greatest threat to Harold's reign and to Anglo-Saxon England itself. William of Normandy was no ordinary duke seeking to expand his territories. He was the bastard son of Duke Robert, who had clawed his way to power through a combination of political cunning and military innovation that would revolutionize warfare across Europe. William had spent his entire adult life perfecting the art of combined arms warfare, integrating heavy cavalry, disciplined infantry, and skilled archers into a military machine unlike anything the world had seen. The Normans were not simply French nobles seeking new lands to conquer. They were the descendants of Viking raiders who had settled in northern France 2 centuries earlier, adopting French language and customs while retaining the martial prowess and tactical flexibility of their Norse ancestors. Under William's leadership, they had developed military techniques that blended the best of both worlds, the disciplined formations and siegecraft of continental Europe, with the aggressive spirit and adaptability of Scandinavian warriors. William's claim to the English throne rested on more than just ambition. According to Norman sources, Edward the Confessor had promised him the succession during a political crisis in 1051. More damaging still were the allegations that Harold himself had sworn an oath of loyalty to William during a diplomatic mission to Normandy. Whether this oath was freely given or extracted under duress would be debated by historians for centuries, but William used it as the cornerstone of his legal justification for invasion. To the Norman Duke, Harold was not a rival claimant, but an oath-breaking usurper whose very existence was an affront to divine justice. The military preparations for what would become the Norman Conquest revealed the sophisticated planning that William brought to every aspect of his campaigns. Throughout the summer of 1066, craftsmen across Normandy worked to build the largest invasion fleet assembled since the Roman conquests. Over 700 ships were constructed or requisitioned, each designed to carry the specialized equipment that would make the Norman army so devastatingly effective. These vessels transported not just men and horses, but prefabricated wooden castles that could be assembled within hours of landing, establishing immediate strongholds from which the Normans could project their power. The composition of William's invasion force demonstrated his understanding that victory would require more than simple numerical superiority. Among his 10,000 warriors were representatives of the military elite from across northern France. Norman knights formed the core of his cavalry, but they were joined by Breton horsemen, Flemish mercenaries, and adventurers from as far away as southern Italy. Each group brought their own specialized skills and fighting techniques, creating an army that could adapt to any tactical situation. The technological advantages that the Normans possessed were not immediately obvious to their English opponents. The Anglo-Saxon military tradition had evolved over centuries of fighting Viking raiders and rival English kingdoms. Their tactics centered on the shield wall, a defensive formation that had proven devastatingly effective against traditional infantry and cavalry attacks. The housecarls, Harold's elite bodyguards, were among the finest warriors in Europe, wielding their terrible two-handed battle axes with skill that bordered on artistry. But the Normans brought innovations that would render these traditional tactics obsolete. Their heavy cavalry represented a quantum leap in military technology, combining the mobility of mounted warfare with the protection of advanced armor and the striking power of the couched lance. Norman knights were not simply warriors on horseback. They were living weapon systems trained from childhood to fight as coordinated units, capable of executing complex maneuvers that required split-second timing and absolute trust in their comrades. The crossbow, still relatively unknown in England, gave Norman infantry the ability to penetrate Anglo-Saxon armor at ranges that traditional archers could not match. More importantly, crossbows could be operated by soldiers with far less training than the skilled longbowmen that other armies relied upon, allowing William to field large numbers of effective missile troops without the decades of preparation that bow warfare traditionally required. As Harold Godwinson celebrated his coronation in Westminster Abbey on January 6, 1066, he could not have imagined the perfect storm of catastrophe that was already gathering on the horizon. The new king faced threats from multiple directions, each requiring different strategies and resources that would stretch his capabilities to the breaking point. The coming months would test not only Harold's military genius, but the very foundations of Anglo-Saxon society itself. The first blow fell not from the south, where William was gathering his invasion fleet, but from the north, where Harald Hardrada had formed an alliance with Harold's own brother. Tostig Godwinson had been Earl of Northumbria until his brutal misrule provoked a rebellion that forced Harold to exile him in 1065. Bitter and seeking revenge, Tostig offered his local knowledge and political connections to the Norwegian king, creating a two-front war that would prove to be Harold's undoing. The summer of 1066 brought with it more than just the usual seasonal campaigns that marked medieval warfare. It brought a sense of impending doom that seemed to settle over England like morning fog. Harald Hardrada's massive fleet of 300 longships had been spotted off the Scottish coast, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the grey waters of the North Sea with terrifying purpose. Each vessel carried seasoned warriors who had spent their lives perfecting the art of sudden, devastating violence that had made the Vikings the scourge of Europe for 3 centuries. But Hardrada was no ordinary Viking chieftain seeking quick plunder before winter's approach. This was a calculated invasion designed to seize and hold territory, backed by the resources of the Norwegian crown and guided by Tostig's intimate knowledge of English defenses. The Norwegian king had spent months preparing for this campaign, gathering not just warriors but siege equipment, supplies for extended operations, and the political alliances necessary to sustain a long war of conquest. When the Norwegian fleet entered the Humber estuary in September, it represented the largest Viking invasion force to threaten England in over half a century. The sight of those hundreds of ships stretching to the horizon must have been both magnificent and terrifying to the English who witnessed it. These were not the desperate raiders of previous generations, driven by famine or political upheaval in their homelands. These were the elite warriors of a prosperous kingdom, equipped with the finest weapons and armor that Viking craftsmanship could produce. Harold Godwinson's response to this northern threat demonstrated both his strategic brilliance and the fatal flaw that would ultimately destroy Anglo-Saxon England. Rather than remaining in the south to face William's anticipated invasion, Harold made the bold decision to march north and crush the Norwegian threat decisively. It was a gamble that revealed his confidence in his own military abilities and his deep understanding of the political dynamics that held his kingdom together. The march north became a masterpiece of military logistics that showcased the organizational capabilities of the Anglo-Saxon state at its peak. Harold's army covered nearly 250 miles in less than 3 weeks, maintaining discipline and cohesion while moving at a pace that would have been remarkable even by modern standards. Village after village watched in awe as the royal army thundered past, their banners streaming in the wind, the rhythmic tramp of thousands of feet echoing like distant thunder. The Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25th became Harold's greatest triumph, and ultimately, the foundation of his doom. The Norwegian army, caught completely off guard by the speed of Harold's approach, was scattered across both sides of the River Derwent. Many had left their armor behind in the ships, expecting only a routine exchange of hostages with the surrendered city of York. Instead, they found themselves facing the full fury of the English army in a battle that would be remembered as one of the most brutal encounters of the age. The fighting at Stamford Bridge lasted from dawn until dusk, a grinding, merciless struggle that left thousands dead on both sides. Harald Hardrada fell early in the battle, struck down by an arrow that pierced his throat, his massive frame toppling like a felled oak. Tostig Godwinson met his end shortly after, cut down in the melee as he tried to rally the Norwegian forces. The last great Viking invasion of England died with them, its survivors limping back to Norway and barely 24 ships from the 300 that had arrived with such confidence. But victory came at a price that Harold could not afford to pay. His army was exhausted, bloodied, and significantly reduced in numbers. Worse still, the cream of the English nobility had been committed to this northern battle, leaving the south dangerously exposed. As Harold celebrated his triumph over the Vikings, William of Normandy was loading his ships across the English Channel, waiting only for favorable winds to launch an invasion that would find England's defenses fatally weakened. The news reached Harold on October 1st, delivered by a messenger whose horse had been ridden nearly to death in the desperate race to carry word of William's landing. The Norman Duke had come ashore at Pevensey on September 28th, immediately beginning the construction of a fortified beachhead that would serve as his base of operations. Unlike the Vikings, who relied on speed and surprise, William methodically established a secure foothold from which he could project power inland. William's landing strategy revealed the sophisticated planning that characterized every aspect of the Norman invasion. Rather than attempting to storm established English fortifications, he chose to establish his own stronghold on the coast and force Harold to come to him. This approach played to Norman strengths, while negating many of the advantages that the English might have enjoyed fighting from prepared positions. The psychological warfare that accompanied the Norman landing was as calculated as the military aspects. William's forces immediately began devastating the countryside around their beachhead, burning villages and slaughtering livestock in a deliberate campaign designed to provoke Harold into hasty action. The Norman Duke understood that time was his enemy. Every day that passed allowed Harold to gather more forces and recover from the exhaustion of the northern campaign. Harold's response to William's landing demonstrated both his courage and the impossible position in which he found himself. Despite the advice of his counselors to delay and gather a larger army, Harold chose to march south immediately. His decision was driven not just by military necessity, but by the political reality that every day of Norman occupation weakened his authority and encouraged other potential rebels to challenge his rule. The march south became a race against time that would determine the fate of two civilizations. Harold's battered army retraced their steps from Yorkshire to London in just 4 days, a feat of endurance that pushed men and horses beyond their normal limits. Along the way, they gathered what reinforcements they could, But many of the southern nobles had yet to fully mobilize their forces, leaving Harold with an army significantly smaller than the one he had led against the Norwegians. The two armies that would meet at Hastings represented fundamentally different approaches to warfare that had evolved over centuries of conflict. The Anglo-Saxon military tradition emphasized the courage of individual warriors fighting in disciplined formations, relying on superior equipment and fighting spirit to overcome numerical disadvantages. The Norman approach integrated different types of forces into a flexible system that could adapt to changing battlefield conditions with devastating effect. As Harold's weary forces took their positions on the ridge near Hastings on the morning of October 14th, they faced an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. The Norman army that deployed in the valley below was not simply larger or better equipped than their previous opponents. It represented an entirely new way of thinking about warfare that would soon make the traditional Anglo-Saxon methods obsolete. The dawn light revealed the full scope of William's military innovation as his forces arranged themselves for battle. Heavy cavalry formed the center of his line, their lances glinting in the morning sun, while disciplined infantry took positions on the flanks. Behind them, ranks of archers prepared their weapons, ready to rain death upon the English shield wall from distances that traditional warfare had never contemplated. The sight that greeted Harold's exhausted warriors as they gazed down from Senlac Hill was both magnificent and terrifying. Spread across the valley below, William's army gleamed like a steel serpent coiled for the strike. This was no rabble of fortune seekers or desperate adventurers. This was the cutting edge of medieval military evolution, a machine of war refined through decades of continental conflict into something the Anglo-Saxon world had never encountered. The Norman knights who formed the heart of William's force were themselves a revolution in human warfare. Each man represented years of training and enormous financial investment, mounted on war horses that cost more than a peasant family would see in a lifetime. Their conical helmets caught the October light, while their kite-shaped shields formed a wall of painted wood and steel that stretched across the battlefield. These were not simply warriors on horseback, they were living weapons, trained from boyhood to fight as a single organism, capable of maneuvers that required absolute trust and split-second coordination. Behind the cavalry, the Norman infantry presented an equally formidable sight. Unlike the loosely organized levies that often made up medieval armies, these men moved with the precision of veterans who had fought together across multiple campaigns. Their mail hauberks glinted dully in the morning light, while their spears formed a forest of steel points that would support the cavalry charges to come. Many carried the newer crossbows, weapons that could punch through Anglo-Saxon armor at ranges that traditional archery could never match. But it was the discipline of the Norman force that truly set them apart from their opponents. As Harold's men watched, the enemy army maneuvered with a coordination that spoke of endless drill and absolute confidence in their commanders. Units wheeled and reformed with mechanical precision, their movements guided by horn calls and banner signals that had been perfected through years of warfare across France and beyond. The English position on Senlac Ridge represented the culmination of centuries of Anglo-Saxon military thought. The shield wall that formed along the hilltop was more than just a defensive formation. It was the physical manifestation of a warrior culture that prized individual courage and collective determination above all else. Each man in that line was bound to his neighbors by oaths of loyalty that transcended mere military necessity, creating bonds of brotherhood that had held firm through countless battles. At the center of the English line stood Harold's housecarls, warriors whose reputation stretched across Europe. These men had been selected not just for their fighting skill, but for their unwavering loyalty to their king. Clad in the finest mail that English smiths could produce, they wielded the terrible Danish axes that had become their trademark. In the hands of a skilled warrior, these weapons could cleave through armor and bone with devastating effect, capable of felling a warhorse with a single blow. The shield wall itself was a masterpiece of defensive engineering perfected over generations of warfare. Each warrior's shield overlapped with those of his neighbors, creating an almost impenetrable barrier of wood and steel. Behind this wall, spears thrust forward in deadly rhythm, while the axes of the housecarls waited to deal crushing blows to any enemy brave enough to close with the line. It was a formation that had broken Viking charges and shattered Saxon rebellions for 3 centuries. Yet as the morning mist lifted from the battlefield, Experienced warriors on both sides could sense that something unprecedented was about to unfold. The Norman army that faced them represented more than just another claimant's ambition. It embodied a new philosophy of warfare that would render traditional English tactics obsolete in the space of a single day. William himself rode among his troops, his presence instantly recognizable by the papal banner that flew above his head. The Duke of Normandy had transformed this invasion into a holy war, claiming divine sanction for his cause and promising spiritual rewards to those who fell in his service. This religious dimension added another layer to the psychological pressure facing Harold's forces, as they found themselves fighting not just for their king but against warriors who believed God himself blessed their cause. The morning hours passed with agonizing slowness as both armies made their final preparations. Priests moved among the Norman ranks, offering blessings and final absolution to warriors about to risk their souls in battle. On the English side, the traditional war songs echoed across the hilltop, ancient chants that connected these men to generations of ancestors who had stood in similar shield walls against impossible odds. When the Norman advance finally began, it came with a deliberation that was more terrifying than any wild charge. Archers moved forward first, their crossbows and hunting bows sending flights of arrows arcing high into the morning sky. These missiles crashed down upon the English shields with a sound like hail on a thatched roof, the first taste of the technological revolution that was about to engulf Anglo-Saxon England. The shield wall absorbed this initial bombardment with the stoic determination that had made it legendary. English warriors crouched behind their interlocked shields, feeling the impact of Norman arrows while waiting for the real battle to begin. Occasionally, a shaft would find a gap in the defensive line, and a man would fall with a grunt of pain. But the formation held firm as fresh warriors stepped forward to fill any breach. Behind the archers, Norman infantry began their advance up the slope, their shields locked together in formations that mirrored their English opponents. These were not the undisciplined charges of earlier medieval warfare, but carefully coordinated assaults designed to test specific points in the English line. Each attack was preceded by a shower of crossbow bolts, followed by the methodical advance of heavily armored spearmen who sought to force gaps in the shield wall through sheer persistence. The first clashes between Norman infantry and the English line produced scenes of carnage that veterans of many battles would remember for the rest of their lives. Spears thrust between shields, seeking the gaps in mail armor where a well-placed point could find flesh. Axes rose and fell with mechanical precision, their heavy blades crushing helmets and splitting shields with devastating effect. Men screamed in pain and rage as they grappled at close quarters, each side fighting with the desperation of those who knew defeat meant death or slavery. Yet despite their ferocity, these initial Norman attacks made little impression on the English position. The shield wall bent but did not break, its defenders drawing strength from centuries of tradition and the presence of their king fighting in their midst. Harold Godwinson had positioned himself at the most dangerous point of the line, where his banner could be seen by every English warrior, his presence a constant reminder of what they were fighting to protect. It was then that William unleashed his secret weapon, the innovation that would change the course of the battle and the future of England itself. Norman war horns sounded across the valley, their brazen notes carrying a message that every knight understood. The heavy cavalry began to move forward, first at a walk, then at a trot, finally building to the thunderous charge that was the signature of Norman warfare. The sight of hundreds of armored horsemen thundering up the slope must have been both magnificent and terrifying to the English warriors who witnessed it. These were not the lightly armored raiders that Anglo-Saxon armies had faced in previous conflicts, but heavily equipped knights whose lances couched under their arms could punch through the strongest armor. Their war horses had been trained specifically for battle, taught to strike with their hooves and bite with their teeth, turning each mount into a weapon as dangerous as its rider. The impact of the first cavalry charge sent shockwaves through both armies that could be felt across the battlefield. Lances splintered against English shields with sounds like breaking trees, while horses reared and screamed as they met the forest of spear points that thrust out from the shield wall. Knights who had broken their lances drew swords and maces, hacking down at the English line while their mounts trampled over fallen bodies. The battle raged for 9 hours, an eternity by medieval standards, but when Harold fell with an arrow through his eye and Norman axes hacking at his broken body, More than just a king died on that blood-soaked hill. The shield wall that had protected England for centuries crumbled in minutes, and with it collapsed an entire civilization. Anglo-Saxon England, with its rich traditions, sophisticated laws, and warrior culture, vanished forever beneath Norman hooves. Within a generation, the very language would be transformed, the nobility replaced, and a new England would rise from the ashes of the old. Hastings was not just a battle lost, it was the death of a world.